Hi everyone, thank you for joining me here, also virtually in this blanket fort. My name is Marissa Borah, and I will be presenting my capstone research entitled Empowering the Youth, the Revolutionary Religious Rhetoric of Pope St. John Paul II. The reason I decided to spend an entire semester studying JP2 and his rhetoric is because I learned something very interesting. I knew he was important in the Catholic Church, but I learned that he had a vast political influence outside of the context of simply Catholicism. He is accredited by historians as well as George Bush Sr. and Mikhail Gorbachev as being a major influence in the fall of communism, not just in his home country of Poland, but in all of Europe. And he's also credited as inspiring the collapse of several dictatorships in Latin America. And I found this particularly fascinating because this is a man with no political power of his own, no military power of his own. And so how did he, through rhetoric alone, enact such a major political influence on the world? So for my capstone research, I decided to study 3 speeches that John Paul II gave in the 1980s to the youth in countries under authoritarian regimes. I conducted a generic criticism to figure out if there was a particular genre of rhetoric that he's using in all of these situations, in the hopes of uncovering how deeply held religious beliefs can be mobilized towards political ends. So before getting into the analysis, I'm going to give a brief overview of papal rhetoric and what that has looked like historically so that we have more of a context for why John Paul II is so different. So historically, the main form of communication that's used to have church doctrine passed on from the Pope to the people is encyclicals. These are letters that the Pope writes to the bishops of the worldwide church, and they then pass it on to fellow priests, and it is transmitted to the lay people through homilies and through other church discourse. In these letters, the Pope is the representative of God, the supreme authority, and the doctrine that he is writing is considered the objective truth. And so these truths are passed on through these letters down the hierarchy of the church. What makes John Paul II different isn't that he did not write encyclicals, because he did, but these weren't his primary channels of transmitting church doctrine. Although papal travel outside of Rome is historically rare, John Paul II traveled more than every single other pope in history combined. And more so than that, John Paul II traveled so much that Encyclopedia Britannica claims he has been seen in person by more people than anybody else in history. And that's a cool piece of trivia, but it also reveals this incredible rhetorical significance that for the majority of the countries that John Paul II visited, he was the first pope to ever step foot on their land. Every time he was giving these speeches that I'm analyzing, he is enacting this moment of historical significance, and every member of the audience is a part of this historical moment. So it's a big deal, to put it in simple terms. So the method that I use to examine these speeches, to look at them more deeply and uncover the rhetoric used, is generic criticism. It was a method that Sonia Foss talks about, and it's mainly used to ask the question, why do particular situations call for particular forms of rhetoric? Rhetorically speaking, a genre is a distinctive pattern of characteristics shared by discourses given in similar circumstances. So the 3 speeches I chose, one was given in South Korea in 1984, the second was given in Chile in 1987, and the third was given in Malawi in 1989. And while these countries are very separated geographically, politically they all shared basically the same situation. They all were countries under the rule of a dictator and a military government. They all had leaders who had stripped the citizens of their civil liberties and who persecuted their political opponents. So the situation politically in each of these countries is the same. And the audience for each of these three speeches is the youth. It's the same. What generic criticism really boils down to is not just looking at the shared characteristics of these speeches, it's identifying the organizing principle. Because these characteristics of rhetoric can be shared by tons of different situations and tons of different forms of rhetoric, but what makes a genre distinct is the internal dynamic between these characteristics. An organizing principle means that these characteristics show up time and again together in these same circumstances, and they're so united that if any one of them was removed, it would significantly alter the artifact. So the organizing principle attempts to uncover why this rhetoric is used in the particular situation. So when I looked at these three speeches, I found three themes that were used in all of them. And these themes were building solidarity, affirmation of the youth, and call to action. So first, building solidarity. In each of these speeches, John Paul II starts by addressing his audience, dear young people, or dear young friends. And he continues to tell the audience how excited he is to be with them, how much he's looked forward to this moment, how dear they are to him. And so it creates this bond of friendship, and it also builds his ethos, his credibility with the audience. When he comes into the situation, the Pope already has the ethos of being the Pope. The Pope is this office of greatest moral authority in the church. So he already has this formal ethos coming in, but the ethos that he creates in this discourse is a personal one. He expresses to the audience the goodwill he has for them. He creates this personal bond and this connection of friendship. And so now he has the credibility in the eyes of the audience, not just because of the Pope, but because of who he is, because they see him face to face and hear his voice and have felt his friendship. Once he builds this bond of friendship, the Pope moves on with this affirmation of the youth. He tells young people who they are. And who they are is something great in his eyes. According to John Paul II, to be young is to appreciate sincerity. It's to be attracted to freedom and justice and truth and beauty and goodness. To be young is to have this boundless energy and optimism. He tells the youth that they're social reformers. And so in doing all of this, he projects his values onto the audience. These are audiences of the youth, of young people, who do not have a fully formed identity yet. And in Mead's concept of the generalized other, the self emerges through the process of role-taking. And here the Pope is dropping a role in their lap, one that is easy to accept because he doesn't say, you have these virtues once you've done anything to earn them. These virtues are theirs simply because they're young. And so he projects this identity onto the audience, these values onto the audience. And once he does this, once he builds this solidarity and affirms the youth, he primes his audience for the call to action, which is the most important aspect of these speeches. In all three of these speeches, the call to action is comprised of when and who and what. He imparts this sense of kairos on the audience, that right now is a critical moment for decisive action. He tells his audience that the fate of humanity rests in what they do right now. He makes these claims of urgency and gravity of the situation. And for the Pope, for John Paul II, it is not just enough that the youth realize society needs to change now. It's so deeply important to him that the youth have a role in this. He tells them in South Korea, you are the hope of the future for all of us. He tells them in Chile, the future of your homeland depends on you. He tells them in Malawi, you young people especially will have a decisive part to play in the development of your country. And so it's not just enough that this is the moment for action. It's the moment for action specifically for each member of his audience. And the action that's required is a grand sacred struggle. John Paul II takes this mission of social justice and political action, and he situates it in a religious context. In South Korea, it's a battle. It's the good fight of faith. In Chile, it's transformation. It's the construction of a new civilization. In Malawi, it's a great challenge, an opportunity for conversion, the path to holiness. Whatever phrases he uses to describe the action, in each of these cases, it invites the audience, it draws them into something that is greater than they are. It takes this political action and puts it into a more eternal context. So now, the response to the call to action isn't just a response to John Paul II. It's a response to the call of God. It carries implications for the soul of each audience member. And these three elements, most especially the call to action and the ways that these three things work in them, uncover the organizing principle, which is making the audience feel valued. Each of these elements works towards the purpose of making the audience feel valued as the source of their empowerment and mobilization. This friendship makes the audience feel valued. Even before he opens his mouth, the mere fact that the Pope has made the effort to physically travel to the country of this audience shows that he values them. And then when he affirms the youth, he tells them all of these qualities they have, he values them. And when these two things are combined, they transform the call to action. It's not a burden or a responsibility anymore. The call to action is now another way of valuing the audience, because as he tells them, the youth is important, the future depends on you, and you are deeply necessary, you are essential. And so now this call to action isn't an invitation from the Pope, it's almost the Pope begging the audience to take part in this, and so they feel important and valued. And these characteristics may appear in political rhetoric or secular contexts, but what makes this revolutionary religious rhetoric is the religious context. It is inseparable from the rest of it, because the Pope, as the head of the church for his Catholic audience, is the representative of God. And so this transforms every one of these aspects of his discourse. It is not just expressing John Paul II's friendship to the audience. He's forging this solidarity between his audience and the Catholic Church, and between his audience and God. He is affirming the youth and telling them these qualities he sees in them, and it's not just John Paul II who sees them in the youth, it's God who sees these qualities in the youth. And so this call to action isn't John Paul II's invitation. It's God who is calling them to contribute to the well-being of their country and its people in a way that's lasting. This revolutionary religious rhetoric has the potential to be extremely powerful. If it's successful, the audience members internalize the values of the speaker and the collective identity of the religious group. And the call to action is now viewed as a sacred mission, which they are called to and maybe even destined to fulfill. It mobilizes people in a way that transcends this earth and brings in a supernatural realm. And so this rhetoric is important to study. I am sure that John Paul II is not the only one who has used it. It would be very fascinating to examine how other religious groups have used revolutionary religious rhetoric for political purposes and the effects that it has had on society. But certainly, it has been used by John Paul II and has had a great impact on the audiences that he has used it with. I think it's no mistake that he uses it with young audiences who don't have a fully formed identity, so that these values and this call to action becomes incorporated into their sense of self. So John Paul II's former press secretary said that the single fact of John Paul II's election in 1978 changed everything. And I would have to agree after doing this research, because he had such a great impact politically. He can't be given the credit for causing political change, but in South Korea, Chile, and Malawi, all of these countries saw a radical transformation of their political world in the 3 years following Pope John Paul II's visit. All three of them saw a transition to democracy in the 3 years following his visit. And I don't think that that's a coincidence. We have seen that this revolutionary religious rhetoric has the potential to mobilize audiences, especially young audiences, in a way that is deeper than just this world. It invokes the supernatural, it's transcendent. And so when former secretary of the Soviet Union said that John Paul II was capable of causing trouble, and not just in Poland, he was right. This man has had a profound influence on global politics, and more so than that, it has major implications for the role of the Pope in the Catholic Church. We've only had 2 popes since St. John Paul II, and it remains to be seen how these 2 live up to the precedent that was set by this man. He has revolutionized papal rhetoric, both in content and the way it's transmitted, and he forever altered the Church's cultural memory and expectations for what it means to be a pope, and how the Pope is to spread these beliefs to the Church as a whole. So, future popes, take note.